The cameras were rolling, the lights were blinding, and millions of Americans were watching. What was supposed to be a polished morning show interview had just turned into a national reckoning. On one side sat a seasoned TV host, confident and prepared with her sharp cue cards. On the other sat Darius Bell, a self-made black entrepreneur who had clawed his way from the streets of Birmingham to the boardrooms of billion-dollar contracts. But this wasn't just about business. This was about perception, power, and prejudice. The host thought she had him cornered, ready to expose him as a token of diversity rather than a titan of industry. What she didn't expect was that Darius wouldn't just defend himself. He would flip the script, dismantling her narrative piece by piece, until the entire nation was left in stunned silence. This wasn't an interview anymore. It was a battle. And when it ended, America would never look at success or fairness the same way again. Before we dive deeper into this story, make sure to subscribe to our channel, Hidden Black Stories, where we uncover the powerful untold stories that challenge injustice, expose truth, and celebrate resilience. It began with a single email. A brief, almost impersonal message from the producers of The Morning Exchange, one of the most watched talk shows in America. They wanted Darius Bell, the CEO of Innovis, to appear on an upcoming segment about diversity in business. For many entrepreneurs, such an invitation would be a career-defining moment. National exposure, prime airtime, millions of viewers. But for Darius, it came with a familiar sting. He had seen this play out before. Black entrepreneurs invited into the spotlight not for their brilliance but as symbols, briefly celebrated, then quietly dismissed. His company, Innovis, wasn't some scrappy startup begging for attention. It had just secured a multi-million-dollar government contract, outbidding some of the biggest names in tech. That wasn't luck. That was decades of sleepless nights, risk-taking, and relentless work. And yet he knew why they wanted him: to question his legitimacy. In his office that afternoon, staring at the email, Darius hesitated. His assistant, Tasha, immediately sensed his unease. She had seen too many examples of so-called diversity features that ended with the guest torn apart on national television. "They love a success story," she often said. "But they love tearing one down even more." Darius understood. America had always been fascinated by black excellence, but only within limits. Celebrate the athlete, cheer for the entertainer, but question the CEO, question the leader, question the man who dared to rise in spaces never designed for him. Still, Darius wasn't the type to back down. His entire life had been about walking into rooms where no one thought he belonged and proving them wrong. If this was a setup, then they were playing chess with the wrong man. He accepted. The morning of the interview arrived with its own weight. The studio was sleek, cold, and transactional. The young producer barely made eye contact when she briefed him. The makeup artist powdered his face with indifference, treating him like just another guest on a long list. And then he saw it. The segment preview flashing across the monitor in the green room. The black tech boom. Talent or special treatment. So that was their angle. For many, it would have been the first crack in their armor. But for Darius, it only sharpened his focus. He adjusted his suit, straightened his tie, and prepared to walk onto a stage that wasn't just about him. This was about every black entrepreneur who had been told they didn't belong. Every leader whose success was chalked up to quotas instead of competence. As the cameras lit up and the host greeted him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, Darius already knew. This wasn't going to be a polite conversation. This was going to be a confrontation. And he wasn't stepping into it for applause. He was stepping into it for truth. The set of The Morning Exchange was crafted to look warm and welcoming, soft colors, glass tables, and polished lighting that made everything appear harmless. But beneath that polished surface was a sharper edge. Darius felt it the moment he took his seat. Across from him sat Madeline Royce, the show's lead anchor, a veteran with decades of experience. She was known for her charm, but also for her ability to corner her guests with questions that cut deeper than they realized. Today, she looked calm and composed, her cards neatly stacked in her hands. But her eyes held the glint of someone ready to play a very different game. She began with flattery, her words smooth and practiced. Darius Bell, CEO of Innovis, a true American success story. For a moment, it sounded genuine, the kind of praise a morning show audience would eat up. But Darius had seen this routine before. Build him up first, only to chip away at the foundation later. She moved quickly to the government contract Innovis had just secured. $200 million, outbidding tech giants with names that carried weight and influence. Darius gave a measured answer. He and his team had worked hard, developed an encryption system that outperformed the competition, and earned the contract on merit. Then came the shift. A pause. A glance at her cue cards. Some industry experts, Madeline said carefully, suggest that Innovis may have benefited from federal diversity incentives, that perhaps this wasn't just about being the best, but about meeting certain quotas. And there it was, the angle. Not innovation, not excellence, not decades of persistence. Quotas. For a moment, silence stretched across the studio. The crew members behind the cameras stiffened. Everyone knew what was happening, but no one dared interrupt. Darius didn't flinch. He let the pause linger, just long enough to make the weight of the accusation sink in. Then, with calm precision, he replied. He reminded her, and everyone watching, that when a black entrepreneur wins, the first assumption is that they had help. But when billion-dollar firms, often run by the same families for generations, win those same contracts, nobody questions their legitimacy. Nobody calls it favoritism. The words landed heavy. The air in the studio shifted. But Madeline wasn't rattled. She leaned in further, her voice still smooth, her smile intact. She began peeling back the layers of his personal story. His childhood in Birmingham, raised by a single mother, public schools, no Ivy League credentials, no family name to open doors. To the casual viewer, it sounded like admiration. To Darius, it was a setup. The implication was clear. How does someone from nothing suddenly rise high enough to beat out the titans of industry? Again, he refused to take the bait. He explained, firmly but without anger, that his success wasn't handed to him. It was built from long nights, 3 jobs to pay for his degree, sleeping in his office when he couldn't afford rent, grinding when no one was watching. That was his advantage. But the more he spoke, the more she pressed. Surely, she insisted, he must have had some special program, some mentor, some extra push. And each time, Darius dismantled the assumption, layer by layer. By now, the producers behind the cameras were frozen, their eyes darting between one another. This wasn't the polished, easy narrative they had scripted. Something real was happening. Something raw, unplanned, and dangerous for their carefully curated morning show. And still, Madeline pushed. She raised the idea that black entrepreneurs were enjoying more opportunities than ever before. Affirmative action, minority business grants, special incentives. Her subtext was undeniable. Maybe his rise wasn't proof of resilience, but proof of favoritism. Darius leaned forward, his voice steady but edged with conviction. He reminded her, and the millions watching, that no one questions which old money bank funds a white-owned startup, or which family connections usher someone into Stanford, or which golf buddy invests in their venture. But when a black entrepreneur succeeds, suddenly the conversation shifts to programs and special treatment. By the time those words left his mouth, the studio was no longer comfortable. It was tense. The audience watching at home could feel it. Something was shifting, something that couldn't be undone. And Madeline, she wasn't smiling anymore. The tension inside the studio was no longer hidden. It pulsed in the silence between questions, in the way the crew behind the cameras barely moved, afraid to break the spell. Millions of viewers were watching from their living rooms, expecting a polite exchange about diversity in business. Instead, they were witnessing something raw, something that felt less like an interview and more like a reckoning. Madeline Royce, a master at maintaining composure, shifted in her seat ever so slightly. She had built a career on control. Control of the narrative. Control of her guests. Control of the message being delivered through the lens. But Darius wasn't playing along. For every pointed implication, he had a sharper truth. For every doubt she raised, he countered with undeniable evidence of resilience. And now, she was reaching for her final cards. Her tone sharpened, the silk wrapped around a blade. "Darius," she began, her words careful, her gaze steady, "your story is powerful, but doesn't your very success prove that the system isn't as broken as some claim?" It was a familiar tactic, using the exception to deny the rule. One success story as proof that inequality didn't exist. To many guests before him, this would have been the breaking point, a chance to retreat, to soften, to nod along and avoid further controversy. But Darius wasn't like many guests. He let out a small laugh, not of amusement, but disbelief. Then he leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, his eyes locking on hers, with a clarity that pierced through the cameras and into every living room in America. "You know what's funny?" he said slowly, his voice steady. "People love to point at one person who made it through the fire and say, 'See, the flames weren't that bad.' But the truth is, just because I climbed out doesn't mean the building isn't still burning." The words struck like a hammer. The silence that followed was louder than applause. Even Madeline's expression faltered for the first time, her perfectly polished mask cracking, if only for a second. But Darius wasn't finished. He pressed on, his voice calm but charged with a weight no script could carry. He painted the picture plainly. Black entrepreneurs denied loans at twice the rate of their white peers, receiving less than 2% of venture capital funding, constantly forced to prove themselves twice over just to be considered equal. The studio was no longer just an interview stage. It was a courtroom, and the evidence was damning. Madeline tried to recover, turning slightly toward the camera as though appealing to her audience. She framed her next point carefully, suggesting that perhaps the attention given to black entrepreneurs was disproportionately large, that their stories were highlighted for their marketability, not their merit. The suggestion hung in the air, like smoke. Darius shook his head slowly, almost pitying the argument. "So now," he said, his tone edged with disbelief, "the problem is that we get too much attention? In a world where 90% of Fortune 500 CEOs are white men, where billions in tech funding go almost exclusively to white-owned startups, you're telling me the issue is that people like me get too much press?" It wasn't a question. That needed an answer. It was a statement, one that laid bare the absurdity of the narrative being spun. And then, for the final blow, Darius did what few guests ever dared. He shifted his gaze away from Madeline and looked straight into the camera, straight into the eyes of America. I know some of you are watching right now, nodding your heads because you've lived this reality. And I know others are sitting there with your arms crossed, telling yourselves this isn't real, that I'm playing victim, that I got here because of some advantage. But deep down, you know the truth. The bar isn't in the same place for everyone. It never was. The weight of his words hung heavy. The host had no comeback. The producers didn't cut to commercial. The crew didn't move. It was as if time itself had paused to make room for the truth. And then he delivered the line that would ignite a national firestorm. A mediocre white man can fail upwards in this country. A brilliant black man has to leap through fire just to get a chance. And even when we succeed, people like you still sit across from us and ask if we really earned it. The studio fell into pure silence. Madeline's jaw tightened ever so slightly, but she had no words left. Darius leaned back in his chair, calm, collected, unshaken. He had not only survived the ambush, he had dismantled it. That was the moment. The clip that would ricochet across social media, cable news, and living rooms nationwide. The moment a single voice cut through decades of polite silence and told America exactly what it didn't want to hear. The cameras finally cut to commercial, but the silence in the studio lingered. Even off-air, no one moved right away. Madeline shuffled her cue cards with the precision of someone desperate to regain control, her smile stretched thin, her eyes betraying unease. The producers spoke hurriedly into headsets, their voices sharp and urgent, but the damage had already been done. By the time Darius left the studio and slid into the back of his car, his phone was vibrating nonstop. Missed calls, text messages, notifications, an avalanche of voices all demanding his attention. Within an hour, clips of the exchange were everywhere. On Twitter, hashtags spread like wildfire. Truth hurts, Darius Bell, system exposed. Some users replayed the moment he leaned into the camera and declared that the bar wasn't in the same place for everyone. Others dissected the now iconic line, comparing mediocrity and brilliance. The video was being shared across platforms not just as an interview, but as a cultural turning point. But the internet is never one-sided. While many praised him as courageous, a voice for the voiceless, others attacked. "Here we go again," one post read. "Another millionaire pretending to be oppressed." Another sneered, "Cry me a river, stop playing the victim." And yet, despite the resistance, it was undeniable. America was talking about him. Cable news picked it up next. On one network, commentators called him bold and refreshing. On another, they accused him of being combative, a symbol of entitlement. Opinion pieces flooded major publications. CNN called it a reckoning. Fox News labeled it dangerous rhetoric. Business Insider questioned what his story revealed about race and success in America. Meanwhile, Madeleine Royce, the woman who had thought she'd control the narrative, was scrambling. The next morning, she opened her show with a carefully rehearsed monologue. She claimed she respected Darius and his accomplishments, but stood by her questions. "My job as a journalist," she insisted, "is to ask what the audience is already thinking." To her critics, it sounded like deflection. To her supporters, it was professionalism. But either way, the spotlight had shifted. She was no longer just the anchor of the morning exchange. She was the woman who had been dismantled live on air. For Darius, the consequences came swiftly. Investors who had once ignored him now flooded his inbox, eager to work with him. At the same time, some corporate partners pulled back, nervous about controversy. Opportunities expanded, but so did the risks. And then came the darker side of fame, the hate mail, the anonymous phone calls, the threats. One day, an unmarked package arrived at Innovis headquarters. Inside was just a single sheet of paper with one word scrawled in black marker, "Enough, Tasha." His assistant insisted on security, but Darius only sighed. He had expected this, because in America, a black man who speaks boldly, unapologetically, always pays a price. Yet for every threat, there was also hope. He received thousands of letters from young entrepreneurs who said his words gave them courage. Messages from parents who showed the clip to their children as proof that speaking truth to power mattered. Communities that rarely saw themselves, represented in boardrooms or on morning television, now had a symbol, a reminder that silence was no longer the only option. Within days, a network offered Darius a primetime special. A one-on-one deep dive into race, business, and the American system. For the first time, he would have the chance to control the entire narrative, not just respond to someone else's framing. Tasha was stunned when he agreed. "You're really going to do it?" she asked. Darius only nodded. "Yes, but on my terms." He wasn't chasing clout. He wasn't chasing fame. This was about something larger, because he knew that what had happened on the morning exchange wasn't just a personal victory, it was a national moment. A mirror held up to America, forcing it to confront the double standards it often pretended not to see. In the days that followed, his viral moment became more than a trending clip. It became a debate in classrooms, in boardrooms, at dinner tables. Was meritocracy real? Were diversity initiatives unfair advantages or necessary corrections? And why, after all this time, was it still easier to question a black man's legitimacy than to acknowledge his excellence? Some called him an activist. Some called him arrogant. Some simply called him right. But regardless of the label, one truth remained. No one could ignore him anymore. And perhaps that was the point, because Darius Bell hadn't just defended himself, he had shattered a myth. The myth that success erases inequality. The myth that opportunity is equal for all. The myth that America is always fair as long as you work hard enough. His story exposed the cracks in that narrative, reminding everyone watching that a single exception does not prove the rule. It only proves how rare exceptions really are. As he stood in his office overlooking the city skyline, the chaos of the past week swirling around him, Darius thought of his younger self, the boy from Birmingham who had been told no more times than he could count. The one who had studied late into the night, worked jobs that barely paid, and built prototypes in the shadows of doubt. That boy had fought for every inch, and now that fight had turned into a national conversation. But the question remained, would America listen? That's where we leave you. What do you think? Does true success mean playing by the rules of a broken system? Or does it mean rewriting those rules entirely? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe more stories like this need to be told, make sure you subscribe to Hidden Black Stories, because the conversations that matter most are the ones some people wish would never happen.